together to find a common purpose. He started his working life with the Irish Health Board, as it was known back then, and he is professionally trained in therapeutic approaches and psychological models. And he worked with children and young people who were wards of court, attempting to support them into community care settings in neighbourhoods, as he says, as far away from formal institutions as possible. It was here that he learned the limits of institutional interventions, especially the well-intended ones. He then took this learning and his fascination with how to do things differently and became founding director of Nurture Development, which is a social enterprise that's dedicated to finding meaningful ways to build communities from the inside out. He is also a member of the Asset-Based Community Development Institute at DePaul University in Chicago. I heavily recommend his most recent book, The Connected Community, Discovering the Health, Wealth and Power of Neighbourhoods, which he co-authored with John McKnight. And this focus on the importance of connected communities and the power of neighbourhoods is so relevant to our work here in Scotland, particularly in looking at the work around reducing health inequalities. So as a much sought after speaker, we really appreciate that he has given of his time freely today to share some of his thoughts and insights. You are in for a real treat this afternoon. So with no further ado, I hand you over to Cormac.
Ruth, thank you so much, and thank you also to Michael and the team for hosting. A large part of the conversation I'd like us to have today is I suppose, centering around a question. The question is, how can we be better guests in the lives of the people that we serve? And I think that question, in a sense, is what I'm going to keep coming back to over the next half an hour. So we've been inundated with fantastic questions ahead of today's session. We want to leave some space to explore those. I'll try to keep things to about a half an hour. We may tip over, but just in terms of framing the conversation, I'd love you, as you listen, or if you're watching the recording, as you watch the recording, to hold that question and keep it alive for yourself. How can I be a better guest in the lives of the people I serve? So Michael is very kindly going to help me with my slideshow today, so you'll hear me saying next slide, Michael, so forgive that, but it's an easier way for us to move forward. So Michael, if you could call up the slideshow, that would be great. In terms of starting the conversation, one of the things I believe in very strongly is this idea that we have to bring intention to our work, and that largely what we seek out or what we try to discover, we tend to find. It's really striking to my mind, and I'll be talking a lot about this, that when we look at our work, whether it's in the field of public health, third sector health, or some other way of trying to be helpful in the universe, when we look at it through the lens of asset-based community development, what we're reminded of is that the communities that we serve are generative places, that are not just the sum of their needs or problems or how we perceive their pathology. That's not to say that there aren't half-empty parts in every community as there are in each of us. But what it is to say, I think, and this is important, is that when we're thinking about health creation, when we're thinking about health production, it's pretty key in my mind. At 30 years on, 38 countries around the world, the evidence is pretty clear on this too. It's not just in my mind, that no institution has a monopoly on health creation. And in fact, thinking that we do is a really good way of burning out our colleagues and ourselves. So changing the narrative to say that communities are half full, that they have all kinds of really important resources, variously defined as assets, building blocks, capacities, that are absolutely of central importance when it comes to health creation. That's the essence of what I want to talk to today. Before we move on to the next slide, I do want to say something that I think could be very practically useful to note, and it's this. My observation over the years is that when it comes to us trying to help communities, if we're coming to that encounter that relationship from an institutional perspective, we tend to follow a pattern of behavior. And one of the features of that pattern is what would be variously understood as a needs assessment or needs analysis. So we ask the community what's in the half-empty part of the glass, and for very good reason, actually. But there's a hidden, at least one, if not more, hidden danger with that. We really have to do that with our hazard lights on. And one of the main hidden dangers, I think, is that every needs assessment I've ever reviewed, and I've read more than I care to admit, they always conclude with the same thing in my mind, and that is that the people who are being analysed need the services of those who are analysing them. So my proposal, I suppose, to you is that the only thing that needs analysis is needs analysis. And if that's your way of getting alongside communities, I'd propose that we think critically about that. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but if what you're interested in is enabling participation and enabling health creation, it's probably not the most useful. So an alternative might be to ask, what are the health creating capacities that are already alive, or potentially, if they were discovered, connected and mobilized, could be invigorated and generated within communities? So that's one piece that I think is really important. If we go on, Michael, to the next slide. The reason I think, aside from ideology and belief systems, the reason I think that looking at change through the lens of ABCD is useful is not because I'm sweet on ABCD. There are 5 key evidential reasons, and I suppose I come at these things as a social scientist, not just as an advocate of a particular approach. The first, I suppose, most important point I want to make here, and I feel this is a conversation, so I'm not preaching, but I think it's an important point to convey with conviction, is that if we're seeing communities, or we're working with institutions that see communities as the sum of their pathology, as backwaters of brokenness, and our job is to don our capes and come in and rescue them, then I think we're likely going to do more harm than good. So this narrative that says, I see you as broken, really obscures our ability to see people as whole and to see people as generative, and beyond individuals, to see the place, the community, what surrounds them as generative. The other issue is probably more moral, but it's got an economic component to it too, and it's that so much of the money that we're seeing, which is intended to end poverty, which clearly is a massive predeterminant of poor health outcomes and diminished health equity, is not going to people living in poverty. It's going to pay people who are providing services to people who are living in poverty. And when we ask those people if they had the salaries of those who are servicing them, would they use the money to buy the services that are being provided? The answer is a resounding no. I think that's a really big challenge for us all. The third reason, and this is a more sociological observation, that I think it's important that we think about what we're doing through the lens of asset-based community development, or at least a community-centered lens, is that across the industrialized world, we're seeing a retreat in citizenship, in active citizenship. People are more likely to be watching the American sitcom Friends than they are to be connecting at neighborhood level and making friends with their neighbors. Now, that's not to say, generally speaking, that's true in all instances. But looking at indices around loneliness and isolation, it is pretty clear that very significant levels of disconnection and fragmentation are becoming a clear feature in our society. It doesn't mean we can't do something about it, but it is something we need to pay close attention to, I think. Another reason why I think it's important to look at what we're doing from a public sector and a third sector perspective through the lens of ABCD is because when we take a deficit approach, when we define people by what is missing, and particularly target groups by what is missing, then folks tend to internalize that map. And it's pretty clear to all of us, I'm sure, as we listen in and reflect on this, that our map is not totally reflective of the territory that we're working in, because how could it be? We can't know the territory in the same way that people who live there and sleep there, 24/7, 365 days a year. Happy summer solstice, by the way. It's the longest day of the year and the shortest night of the year. And In that sense, we have plenty of time to reimagine what the world would look like if we saw it through an asset lens rather than a deficit map. The final thing I want to say, the fifth reason why I think shifting the narrative away from a deficit way of thinking about things more towards an asset-based narrative, is because siloed ways of addressing problems, where we break issues down and very much focus on the environmental movement, the homeless movement, the disability movement, the ex-prisoner movement, and so on, into those very narrow categories. While of course they have virtue and they're important to attend to and give a lot of attention to, the difficulty is that at the political level, what ends up happening inadvertently is we create a perversion where all of our various attempts at creating change start being pitted against each other for scarce amounts of resource. One of the ways I think we can get around all of these dilemmas is to change the unit of change. So instead of just thinking about our work as changing the lifestyle choices of individuals, or indeed reforming our institution, somewhere in the middle of that, almost through the lens of Buddhist economics, as E.F. Schumacher would have thought us 50 years ago, we have to think about a middle way, which says that actually, as well as changing behaviors and hopefully being person-centered in the way we do it and reforming our systems, is the option to think about the neighborhood, small bounded local places, as primary units of change, whether that's economic, health, safety, or whatever the particular area of interest you have. So what's really interesting there is the silos are where smart people go to do dumb things, but neighborhoods are where we could go to actually get a holism, kind of a move past elementary ways of thinking into something that's much more grounded in connection. But what's interesting about the neighborhood is it's the scale at which most regular people feel confident to show up. If somebody says to me, Cormac, you're always talking about community, what have you done lately in your city? I'm not calling from Dublin today, I'm calling actually in from Birmingham today, but my city is Dublin. But that's too big a scale, even, for somebody who's passionate about community change like me. I know that the vast majority of the 1.2 million people who live in neighbourhoods and local villages and parishes in Dublin will respond much better to the question, what would you love to do to improve where you live if 3 of your neighbours helped you? And actually what's really interesting is the answer to that question is very consequential when it comes to population health and public health. And I think we can, reference for evidence and lived experience what happened during COVID lockdown if we're looking for practical examples. Let's move on to the next slide, Michael. So one of the things that I said this actually just an hour or so ago to a lovely audience in Birmingham, that despite all of our progressiveness, it's really striking how often we end up inadvertently speaking out of both sides of our mouths. So while we all, I think now, are very much bought into the Marmot 6 objectives, we really believe in the principle of the social, and dare I add, I think it's important to add the social and political determinants of health. Nevertheless, even though we know that epidemiology is teaching us and evidencing the fact that somewhere between 80 to 85% of what determines health and well-being relates to social and political change, so much of the money that we're spending on health is not going in that direction at all. It's going into acute ends of the system, so it's much more in hospital beds and not near enough in hospitable communities. President Biden reputedly said soon after his inaugural address, when he was speaking to health leaders in the US who were talking about value-based healthcare, he said, and again, I can't say whether this is apocryphal or not, but I love the story. He's reputed to have said, I don't care about your values, show me your budget, and I'll tell you what your values are. And I think that's a very good challenge, actually. We can say something and then our spending says something different. So there's some real challenges, and I think that's where some of the political conundrums are live here, and some of the questions that I reviewed ahead of this conversation are almost asking that, you know, if I practice in this way, if I lead in this way, how can I be assured that people who have maybe governance over budgets will legitimize my efforts and will come in behind me? And I think they're important conversations, and particularly in the context of Scotland, where it's a scale and traditionally with great thought leaders like Sir Harry Burns and others, you really have that, that way of understanding the virtue and the value of the local. So as well as wishing you a happy summer solstice, I should also wish you a happy International Localization Day, because that's what today is as well. So it's you'd swear we set it up, but we didn't. So let's go on to the next slide. What I love is evidence. I do recognize that evidence comes in different forms. So sometimes you need practice-based evidence. You can't prove what you haven't practiced, because if it isn't practiced, it doesn't actually create the evidence out of the practice that gives you a clear understanding of where to go next. And it's really striking to me that so many people will say, we won't move towards change because there isn't enough evidence. But in fact, the evidence doesn't exist because we haven't moved towards change. We haven't moved into practice. So for those who are looking for some reassurance or some factoids in terms of evidence, people are 4 times more likely to find sustainable livelihoods if they are in connected communities. And while job clubs are important, the ONS labour market trends are very, very clear that connected neighbourhoods, connected people, having at least 6 people in your life that you call near neighbours and who miss you on the days you don't show up, is absolutely a critical determinant in terms of sustainable livelihoods. And more broadly, it's really interesting, Robert Sampson, who's the preeminent social scientist around neighbourhood safety, is clear in saying that the 2 key determinants of a safe neighbourhood are village or local place, small bounded area, favela. You know, there are many different words around the world that we use to describe small places. But he's clear in saying that the 2 things that determine safety are how many neighbours you know by first name and how often you're willing to intervene in each other's collective well-being. In other words, do things together. And this is much more consequential based on evidence than the number of police and their response time. Police are really good at dealing with crime. You may disagree with that depending on your lived experience, but mostly that's what they exist for, a bit like hospitals are there to patch us up. But they do not produce safety any more than doctors produce well-being. It's not a product that is produced by a doctor or, you know, curated by a hospital. That actually is community work. It's community business, and then supplemented by institutions. And again, it's really interesting to think about health in those very clear terms. And there's oodles of examples. I use one from the town of Frome in Somerset, but I could just as easily talk to you about the work that we did. My organisation, Nurture Development, got alongside Ayrshire and Arn NHS Trust many years ago, and we were very fortunate that the Scottish Government actually funded an independent evaluation, which you can read on my website, which tells the story actually of what happens when the NHS released money, employed community builders, put them in neighbourhoods, and then supported them to just connect, move people into real powerful, agency-related activities, and again, amazing results there in terms of mental health, physical health, well-being more broadly. So I think I don't want to overclaim, and maybe Michael, we can move on to the next slide. But I just want to put out there this idea that really when we're talking about health, we're talking about 2 tools for change. One is communities, associational. They're driven by trust, effectively. It's not an institution, but the other is institutions. So I really want to spend what little time I have left unpacking that idea, the idea of we actually require 2 tools for change if we're going to achieve population health, if we're going to move things in a public health way. Famously, Robin Dunbar, the UK social scientist, many of you will know about this, the famous figure of 150, which is roughly about the number of people that we can individually stay in proximate, close relational welfare with. And beyond that point, it becomes hard to trust a wider group in that kind of deep way. There's a more detailed account of his findings. Interestingly, more recent researchers are contesting this idea of 150. So as I review the various arguments, I've whittled it down to a broad spectrum of somewhere between 69 people and 248. And quite frankly, my attitude to that argument is I don't really care. The point is that the group is small, it's local, and beyond a certain scale, trust starts to break, and we have to replace trust with centralized organizing systems. And that's the point. So it's really important, I think, that we understand the different kinds of operating systems that we're working with when we think about health and well-being. That certainly institutions matter, but so too do associations, particularly at the local level. Let's go on to the next slide, Michael. So these two tools for change, I want to think about them from a power analysis perspective. And what you see there is a metaphor that I'm using. It's a hydraulic pump. So the basic idea, you know, if your car breaks down, you get out the jack. It's a really small little itty bitty thing by comparison with the car, and yet it's able to lift an entire car up. One of the things that's kind of interesting about the jack is it works exactly the same, but in the opposite way to a syringe, which tends to pull things out of communities. This idea of the relationship that we see between institutions and communities as being like a syringe is what's being depicted here, where we're seeing the relocation of an awful lot of functions that 50 to 100 years ago would have actually been taken on in local communities, like the raising of children, enabling health, assuring security, stewarding our ecology, food creation, consumption, production, and co-creating care. They would have been functions that would have been thought of not as services that were provided to people, but as ways of being in the world. That when you were connected and you collectivized this way, what became manifest from as a collective result of, you know, it taking a village to raise a child, for example, was that it also took a village to co-create and co-steward a whole range of different things, which over the course of time became relocated as functions into institutional space. And this is rather unfair actually on institutions, because it elevated institutions to a point where actually burnout started to increase, levels of distrust started to increase. So at the very time we're asking our institutions to do more and take on monopoly of functions. It's not that we don't need our institutions to provide services, of course we do, but the difficulty is when we as citizens relocate authority and we say my health is in the hands of the doctor, my child's education is solely in the hands of a teacher, my safety is solely in the hands of police officers, we're telling a half-baked story, because that's not the whole truth. The evidence, as I've presented in summary form in this presentation, is that actually the story is much more nuanced. The good news, and we'll move on to the next slide, Michael, please, is that increasingly what we're seeing is a new way that institutions are working in the world. I do a lot of work in Singapore, and I'm working with Yishun Health, which is working with a population base of 2 million people, where the hospital and ally professionals are beginning to realize that as well as providing services, another function is the function of precipitating health creating capacities at neighborhood level. So through well-being compounds, using local narrative in the Singaporean context, what they're doing in effect is they're training staff in community development who are working with partners to enable communities to actually mobilize at grassroots levels the assets, the health creating capacities that they have. So you see now the opposite effect in the hydraulic relationship, where we're seeing institutions relocating and validating the functions of community, because we're never going to lift communities up by putting them down. And this is one of the inadvertent harms that is created by a needs assessment that doesn't also lift up capacity, doesn't also remind people and medically authorize people to recognize that all kinds of social activities, political activities, justice-based activities, inclusion activities are really consequential when it comes to health and well-being, that it isn't something that's just done by a doctor or dispensed as a service, though those are important too. The next slide, Michael, please. So I've been talking a lot about this idea of there being two tools for change. Some of you, as you listen, are familiar, I'm sure, with the idea of systems thinking. So just to speak to that a little, one way of thinking about what I'm saying is to think that there are two different operating systems at play. Now, Abraham Maslow, the humanist psychologist, famously said, if all you use is a hammer, all you'll tend to see is nails. So if what you're being asked to use as a professional is solely medicalized interventions, or even just programs more generally, or services, then you'll tend to see people as clients. And what's really interesting is when we understand the difference in the operating system between the institution and what I would variously call communities or associations, you could really begin to see how those two operating systems could actually work in much better harmony together. And that's the challenge. How do we get them in right relationship? So we create, as societies, we create institutions for good reason. There's nothing wrong with institutions. The issue is not institutions. The issue is monopoly, right? So if somebody was saying to me that community should take over all the health creating capacity and forget institutions, I would be challenging them as much as I'm challenging monopoly that sometimes happens in institutions. And this is sometimes a point that's misunderstood in my work. So if you're looking for more nuance and more discussion around that, I would just ask you to take time to read Rekindling Democracy, because essentially I get into the nuance, and it's disturbing to me. I've recently read a critique of ABCD out of Edinburgh University, and I have to say it was really striking how the level of misunderstanding. So I think I need to do better work at explaining myself. But in any case, the idea here is that we need institutions to make sure there's quality control. Control isn't always bad. I want to know that, things are of a good quality, and that's important. And we need goods and services. We shouldn't knock those. They're essential. Our healthcare system is the better for having all kinds of goods and services and programs that, my father didn't have. So that's really important. And indeed, we need to do more, as Michael Marmot and Sir Harry Burns and others have been reminding us throughout their careers, to ensure those that are furthest at the edge in terms of receiving those supports are closer up to them and receive them as a right. But what's really interesting is that often the social contract is very much grounded in people being clients, being services, and it's quite individualized. It's very hard to work collectively. And even when we do work collectively, we work to, we collectivize by our terms. So we think about patient groups, or we collectivize around a target group or particular pathology. So this is problematic because largely our whole narrative is kind of categorizing around needs. What's really exciting, I think, about the shift more recently in public health and in moving towards questions like what matters to you, is I think we're beginning to realize really deeply and almost existentially that people have to have a sense of choice, consent and control in order for them to feel well, even when they're receiving the right service. In the absence of having that sense of choice, consent and control, they can actually become quite unwell, ironically, even though the intervention may be right. The means by which the intervention is done really matters. But what's really interesting when we go to the operating system of the association of the community is much is related to this idea that I'm in relationship with people by choice, I'm not defined by my relationship to the institution and what I receive in terms of a service, but I am a co-creator. I am a citizen, and our job is to care for each other. So whatever happens, happens because the members do the work, and that's how we define citizenship. I'm defining myself not by my need, but by what I am needed for. So we shift the narrative from needy to needed, albeit with needs. And I think that's a really exciting way of thinking about things, because it moves us to a conversation that recognizes capacity while also respecting the fact that there are needs. We are sometimes consumers. We do require service. It's not an either or. And that's one of the things I would commend in this conversation. If you are reading critique of ABCD and they're saying it's an either or, you're reading a straw man argument. It's just not good social science. So challenge your professors if they're doing that to maybe go back and actually read the literature properly. But it's also a challenge for us in the ABCD fraternity, because maybe we haven't done a good enough job at really stating where we stand in relation to entrenched inequity, and I'll certainly redouble my efforts to do that. We're coming near the end of the presentation, but I wonder if I could just whistle through one or two more slides just to try to round things out a little. So one of the cities, there are many in the UK, which has really taken the whole idea of the neighbourhood as a unit of change to heart is Leeds. They have a history of having neighbourhood networks. In fact, the city I'm in today, Birmingham, is following in their footsteps, and they've developed 10 neighbourhood networks in Birmingham. So increasingly, I think, what we're seeing is the recognition that if, for example, in terms of social care, you're spending £46,000 as a municipality placing somebody in a congregated care setting against their will because there isn't a community alternative. For half of that amount of money, you could support a half-time post in the neighbourhood, which would on average help about 10 people in the neighbourhood who would otherwise be in congregated care settings to have a vibrant, reciprocal, purposeful life. And I think it's really important to think about that. Those outcomes won't happen unless we are really prepared to lean into changing the very nature of how we think about commissioning, how we think about procurement, and maybe some of that is about having the courage to disrupt some of the current narratives and the assumptions that we have that these things can't be changed, because they most certainly can. And increasingly we're recognizing that there are very, very clear ways of doing that. So we've been journeying with Leeds over the last 7 years, and they, like so many other places that we're getting alongside, Northumberland, currently we're working with them on their health inequality strategy again. What's really exciting, I think, about places like Northumberland and Leeds, and again, I go back and say also the Central Belt in Scotland, where we worked with Strathcarron Hospice, is I think you're seeing courageous professionals who recognise their job isn't just to provide services, but it's also to precipitate social capital, to precipitate citizenship, to precipitate collective action at the neighbourhood level. I'm not going to do any more slides, but I've just got to maybe say a word or two to finish and maybe try to summarise everything that I've been saying. I think a metaphor which I personally find useful and I'd offer in conclusion, when I think about social change, when I think about moving in the direction that we're talking about here, I think about a 3-lane swimming pool, where in the first lane, when it comes to health, there are ranges of things that communities can do themselves if we supported them to discover, connect and mobilise those assets and remove the barriers. In the second lane, there are things that communities can do for themselves, but with a little bit of help from us. And the trick is for us to be on tap, not on top, to be in a servant leadership role. And then in the third lane, there are things that absolutely require technology, expertise, our specialism, and we need to do for communities, particularly for folks that are most at the margins, most at the edge. Classically, what has happened is those 3 debates have been pitched against each other as if you have to choose one or the other, and we've got stuck in the third lane. I would argue that a more virtuous conversation and a more democratic conversation is to say, how do we get those lanes in right relationship? You know, in the final analysis, we can't know what communities need when it comes to health and well-being until those communities first know what they have. And once we know that, we can then supplement their health creating capacity. and in that way reduce the level of burnout, increase the level of social capital, and get everything working in a much more proportionate relationship. That's how I believe we get to population health, with communities in the lead. And maybe I'll just finish there, because I know we have a lot of questions we want to go through. Thank you.
Thank you, Cormac. That was absolutely fantastic. That really was. There's so much there for us to take away and reflect on. And you used one of my favourite sayings: it's not either or, it's rarely either or, it's both and. And yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to turn now to our guest questioner, who is Lynn Flanagan. She's a Senior Improvement Advisor for Community Care and Dementia in the iHub at Healthcare Improvement Scotland. Lynn, over to you.
Thank you, Ruth, and thank you so much, Cormac. That was both informative and really inspirational. So my question for you today is, I anticipate that some of the resistance to changing the current paradigm to an asset-based community development approach would be risk aversion. What if it goes wrong? What if communities focus scarce resources in the wrong places? How can we overcome a risk aversion culture?
That's a great question, Lynn. A couple of things to maybe observe here. One is that whenever we encounter resistance, and it's a very human and actually often a very healthy reaction, you know, that there's something happening when there's resistance. I think what we're seeing is we're seeing people experiencing two things. One is a loss of a sense of control, and the other is an increase in the sense of vulnerability. And I think the first thing is wherever we're working with people feeling those feelings, we need to create a lot of psychological safety and enable people to talk about their doubts. So rather than trying to get them on board with this narrative, I think sometimes creating space for a doubts conversation to get the doubts out is really important, that actually whatever you bring is welcome, including your dissent. If we're in a situation where people can't say no, then their yes will be meaningless. Now, the next question is, as we hear the dissent and the doubt, can we open out space for that to be explored? And one of the things that I think we could potentially recognize is that maybe some folks feel that while they want to take the risk to work this way, that they're not going to get the cover or the support or the legitimacy that they require in order to do that safely and do that well. So there's some structural questions here, and I think we can learn a lot from the aviation industry in this regard. And indeed, we have some friends in the aviation industry that have been working very closely with health improvement organizations to think about a new way of not so much thinking about risk, but thinking about creating a safety culture, because that's ultimately what we want to move towards. And they usefully, I think, talk a lot about this idea of safety 1 and safety 2, which I'm going to absolutely butcher for brevity and say basically safety 1 is the idea of making bad things not happen. And safety 2 is how do we create the conditions within which better things and improvement is more likely to happen. And I think it's really important, both latter actually, but it's really important that we move the conversation, and everybody, doubts included, into a narrative that says how do we create a safety culture where we begin to recognize that the people that we have been treating as units of risk and managing are the very people who could actually co-create better health. I mean, this is exactly what pilots had to learn, you know, that it is not wise to treat people like passive consumers, tell them to belt up, shut up and sit down, behave themselves, particularly if there's a hostage situation. And tragically, 9/11 taught us that there were two very different outcomes, and they were in part related to safety consciousness. So I think we have to move in the direction of really cultivating a new narrative around safety, but that has to start by giving people space to bring their doubts to the table.
Fantastic answer. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Cormac. So we're going to move on now to questions from the audience, and just to remind you all about the ability to submit a question, and probably even more importantly, given how many we have, just to vote on the ones that are there so I can see which the most popular ones are to guide my decisions about which I pick. So I'm going to go first to the one that has the most votes, which is What is one action that organisations like the NHS can take today that would practically help and progress productive collaborative working alongside communities?
Don't solve problems that don't belong to you.
Okay.
So one of the concerns that I would have is that in recognition that we need to pivot from the medical to the social, there's a real danger that the NHS start becoming the new expert in community development. And I think the challenge, which will obviously alienate third sector organisations and whatnot, but the challenge I think is for the NHS to recognise that people have been doing this for decades, and so there's a different question I think that needs to be asked. What's already happening, and how do we relocate some resource and authority to those things so that they can crack on and do it, rather than creating new programs which we then deliver to people, which alienate them. So I think that's one thought. Another might be, if you do want to put some money into it, it's really interesting to look at the impact and the evidence that Ayrshire and Arran NHS Trust had, whatever it is now, 5 or more years ago, and yet that fell off a cliff, not because there wasn't an evidence base, but because there wasn't a budget line to actually mainstream it. So let's go back to the evidence we have and take the bold moves. So some of that might, I think it's not about employing community builders to work in neighbourhoods within the NHS, but finding embedded intermediaries outside the NHS who can do that work. Because the challenge is that past a certain scale, our institutions start to create antibodies that kill off the operating system that I'm talking about, which is associational life. But there are smaller entities that with good commissioning and clever procurement, we could actually really support. So I suppose in practice, it's not about employing more people, but maybe changing the way you commission and procure and really get in different kinds of partnerships. So learn to lead by stepping back, in summary.
What a lovely thought-provoking answer. Thank you, Cormac. And on a similar line, but rather than organisations, it's asking about advice to frontline staff to help put communities at the centre of change. What would your reflections be there?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think bringing it back to our own personal practice is always really powerful and empowering and hugely important. So beginning to think about my own practice and what is it that I'm doing whereby I'm taking on functions that could actually be taken on by community. So asking myself, even really granular questions like, am I facilitating a group where the members could actually facilitate themselves? Why am I facilitating a group of breastfeeding mums as opposed to a breastfeeding mum facilitating, for example? So I think thinking about that idea of leading by stepping back, but not abandoning. So that when you step back, what you're trying to do is give enough space to reveal the abundance of community alternatives. So I think that's a really critical thing. So cultivating that in your practice, it could be something as simple as find more seasoned practitioners who really know how to work themselves out of a job and have a track record. They can say, look, I used to take on this function, but now the community are leading it, or I didn't take on the function. I found people in the community who are taking on the function. I cheered them on. Surround yourself with people like that and learn from them. Take membership, take mentoring, all of those things. Also ask your line managers if they are not currently providing space for reflective practice. I didn't say supervision, I said reflective practice, where you're able to sit down and really reflect on your practice. Ask them to, give you a little bit of space with your colleagues to have a bring and share lunch once a month, where all you do is reflect on your practice, but ask the question, am I enabling more people to be interdependent with each other, neighbour to neighbour? And if so, how so? And I think you'll begin to really surface, not good practice, because I'm very hesitant about the term good practice. I think good practice is the enemy of better practice. But what you'll be able to surface is your own learning style and your own ways of following your instinct. And I think that's really important. So I'd love to see more reflective practice in our organizations, and maybe you guys could begin to open up the space for that.
Thank you. And indeed, we already are, particularly some of our work around embedding human learning system approaches, which is very much about how we get a more reflective way of doing things that then we can act on that learning. And really interesting how your answer was very similar to both the organisation and in the individual there, something about letting go, stepping back and empowering others. So thank you. I'm going to move on now. So this is a question from an individual who's anonymous, whose experience of asset-based, of trying to work with people with an asset-based approach is that people and families are busy living their lives, and unless the issue is a negative change, their experience is that there's very little interest in becoming involved in democratic decision making. So what should we as public sector bodies be doing to encourage communities to become interested in asset-based community development? And I think this might be a moment to replug your book as well, Cormac, on this one.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose, well, yeah, so the linear answer is the book kind of takes people through offers a compass and just practical ways of doing ABCD. But I wonder whether I might actually be a little bit controversial here and say, I'm not sure that I would necessarily be trying to get people to work in any way, including an ABCD way. I mean, if people are living their lives, ABCD, first of all, is not a model. It's a description of how people are effective in their lives. So in a sense, the question suggests that people who are effective in their lives are actually doing it already. So don't distract them, let them alone, you know. But I think the question probably goes a bit deeper, and it's people who maybe feel that they don't have anything to contribute to the collective well-being. And I think that's an important question to ask. I remember many years ago in Nebraska, the Nebraska Community Foundation did an analysis of the state, and they identified that by 2050, if people spent their money the way they were spending, what they would do is they would capitalize the death of the state. And the way they would do it is by basically financing their children to leave the state, go to college out of state, buy homes out of state, start businesses, because of course they weren't investing in the state economy. And so their biggest export was their young people. Now, they didn't know that. They were busy getting on with their lives. They were trying to look after their kids. They were trying to make sure that they had an opportunity and so forth. So what was really helpful was when the Nebraska Foundation actually started to engage with local areas, you know, rural, suburban, urban, and kind of gave them the evidence base and sort of almost read their own obituary to them and said, you know, if you keep doing this, what will end up happening is this. How would you like to respond? And one of the things that people said is it would be really, really helpful if, for example, we had local banking systems. If we could think about many people in our neighborhoods really struggle with cost of living, and that's only gotten worse over the last couple of years. They can't afford one car, let alone a second car. And so we, you know, Nebraska Community Foundation and others have been able to say things like, well, let's think about the neighborhood as a unit of economics. What happens if you have a fleet of electric vehicles so that those who, you know, can't afford can get involved? So this is the other end of the spectrum. What's interesting about community is that people pedal in and out. It's not, you know, it's not about sentencing people to community for the rest of their lives. People ebb and flow and things fade back, and, you know, you have school-going children, so you're very involved, and, you know, then things change. I think that's the beauty of it. So this isn't about getting people to do anything. It's about discovering what people themselves care about enough to act upon, and then helping them connect. And for some people that might be, I'm not really interested at the moment, but for others it can ebb and flow throughout their lives. I perhaps could come up with examples, but again, there's more detail in the book, and given that this is introductory, I'll probably stop there and allow another question to be asked before we finish.
Great, thank you. And I think we probably have time for one more question. So this questioner is saying that asset-based community development recognises that the exchange between people sharing their gifts and assets creates connections that requires relationship building. So how do we address the power imbalances between large organisations like the NHS and smaller community-based groups and individuals? So really, this heart of this issue is these power imbalances.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm just back actually a few days from some work with the Quality Patient Forum in Vancouver, so working across BC in Canada, and that very question was asked. It's an excellent question. And in Canada, they don't refer to seesaws the way we do. They call them teeter-totters. And so my answer was that this is like playing teeter-totter with an elephant. So you put the NHS being the elephant on one side, and then community are trying to, get purchase, get leverage. And it's impossible, actually. It really is impossible. So part of what we have to do is change the very nature of the game, right? So a lot of what we're doing is we're relocating responsibility to communities, but not authority and resource. And that's not going to work, quite frankly. So there's a principle in politics called subsidiarity, where no bigger entity will do that which a smaller entity can do. And actually in your legislative frameworks in Scotland, like the Community Empowerment Act and so on, I'm almost certain, it's a few years since I read it, but I'm almost certain that it's one of the core frames in this is this idea that the bigger entity isn't going to come in and take over, but that we actually create space and we relocate authority. And to me, the key of the question we're hearing here is a question about, will we see better relocation of authority? Is that about legislation? Yes. Is that about changing practice? Yes. Is that about thinking differently and acting differently in terms of commissioning and procurement? Yes and yes. Now, we have a lot of really good evidence base around how this stuff works, but my own feeling on it is that what we need to think through a little bit better, and perhaps you're the experts of your own context, is how do we get these things lined up with each other? So we're doing it's almost like we've got lots of apps, but we're not tethering them to the smartphone. So there's more work to be done at the micro, meta, mesa, and kind of micro levels. But I wonder whether part of the answer isn't that we need to recognize that it requires an awful lot of strength from civil society to start changing the narrative, that the institution can't suck salvation from its own thumb. So I think a big part of what we need to see more of is our trade unions, our third sector organizations, and even our local communities pushing back against institutional overreach. And if we look at great practitioners like Katie Kelly in East Ayrshire, and how she relocated authority, then supported local neighbourhoods and local villages to develop their own neighbourhood plans. In a lot of instances that wasn't always easy. There were occasions where they were coming back and they were actually really challenging the council and the NHS and other partners kind of back up a little bit and actually give some more authority to the community. But I don't think that institutions can give that to the community. I think that's for communities to organise and claim for themselves. So it's a bit of a tricky question. I don't know if I've answered it very well, but I think it's a broader question than just for the folks that are on this call. It's actually about democracy.
A really thought-provoking answer again there, and that importance, as you say, of not just the institutions but communities taking back power here as well. So thank you so much, Cormac. That has just been a session that's full of really informative ideas. I think you will have sparked many other thoughts off for many of us. And I'm looking forward to following up with you at some point on range of this. It would be lovely to have you back up to Scotland at some point to talk about this. So thank you. Just before we close, to highlight that next time we are delighted that Jeff Wallace has agreed to come back again. Some of you will remember that last time we had major technical issues and we were not able to get him online. We have now, I think, found the cause of those, so we're quite confident we will be able to get Jeff on the 20th of September joining us again. We just want to highlight that if you've already registered, you do not need to register again, but if not, please do. He's a very inspirational speaker and another individual who I think is going to really challenge some of our current thinking. Also, to highlight, as an improvement organisation, we are really interested in your feedback, and there is an opportunity now to get some feedback on these QI Connect sessions to help us think about how we continuously improve them. A survey link will be posted in the channel, and we would urge everyone to complete this so you can pick it up from the channel. We'll also send it out following this session as well to those who are registered, but please do give us your feedback. We'd love to know what's going well and where we can improve. And then finally, just to remind you all that the rest of our back catalogue is available for you to watch and enjoy on our website. We have had such amazing speakers in QI Connect. You can also watch it on our QI Connect YouTube channel again. So if you've missed anyone, we'd encourage you to go and watch, or actually many of these sessions are worthwhile listening to more than once because they are full of so much valuable information. So thank you everybody for joining, and we look forward to seeing you again in September. Bye all.